So every now and then you may not know it, but you get a glimpse of the sermon writing process. And the way that appears this morning is your bulletin says that there's a reading from Luke 15 and it's other verses. Those are not the verses that we read, because the preacher halfway through the week said, this isn't working. We can't read those verses. So we had to change that, and I didn't catch it in the bulletin. And so if you want to know, the text actually is Luke 15, 1 through 3, and then 11 through 32. That's the parable that we're focusing on during this series. There are two other wonderful parables, actually, in the first 10 chapters of Luke 15, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. But if you want to go home, and I encourage you to do so, to read it, Luke 15, 1 through 3, 11 through 32. And it is quite a lengthy reading. Thank you, Becky, for that. We begin this morning our focus, as Brad said, on that parable that Jesus tells in Luke 15, using Tim Keller's book, The Prodigal God, as our reference. And I commend the book to you. I hope you'll get a copy if you haven't and read along with us. It's very easy read, accessible, but also substantive. There's a lot of meat in it. Today we read the entire parable, again, Luke 15, 11 through 32, to introduce the narrative that so that we all kind of begin at the same place. We all at least have heard the story, have the basic framework of the story in mind. And I encourage you to go back and read it again. There's a lot of detail in that story. Over the next 4 weeks, we'll take a look at smaller sections of the parable, just a few verses here and there, paying particular attention to characters or actions or themes that emerge in those smaller sections of the reading. And as we do, we'll see how in this story, Jesus is doing far more than just wrestling with the dysfunctional dynamics of an ancient family. He's really defining for us the nature of God and what it means to be lost and in need, and what it means to be saved and made whole, and how God indeed does long to welcome all God's children to the feast. So as we begin, I want to at least kind of give us a little vocabulary and begin with that word prodigal. Doesn't appear anywhere in the parable. And it's often misused to refer only to the younger brother. Hence the parable of the prodigal son. In reality, prodigal it can be an adjective, and what it essentially means is recklessly extravagant. Which means that what Jesus is doing here is not talking about so much a son that goes away and comes back home and is welcomed, although that's a part of the story. What Jesus is talking about here with two very different groups of people that we'll encounter in a moment, telling those two groups of people a story about God and how God's reckless, extravagant, prodigal grace is our greatest hope. That said, and as we all know, quite often in Jesus' parable about the father who had two sons, the focus is placed on the flight, the demise, and the return home of the younger brother. All the action we think is there. But this really misses the mark, because there are two brothers in the story who depict different ways of being alienated from God, and different ways of seeking to be in relationship with God. So I want us to do for a moment what Keller does at the beginning of the book and back up in the story and go to those first few verses in Luke 15. This morning we're going to focus less on the parable itself, that'll come over the next 4 weeks, and more on the audience to whom the story was told. Because the people gathered around Jesus that day, the people listening in, make all the difference in how we understand what Jesus is trying to say. So if you will, back to the beginning. In the first 3 verses of chapter 15, Luke tells us, "Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, 'This fellow welcomes sinners, and he eats with them.'" Or if you will, I love the way that Eugene Peterson puts it in his translation, The Message. Try and put yourself in the scene, if you will. There that day in the crowd, listening to Jesus, Luke writes, "By this time, a lot of men and women of questionable reputation were hanging around Jesus, listening intently." That's who Jesus is attracting. That's who's drawn to him. A lot of people of questionable reputation hanging around Jesus, listening intently. The Pharisees and the religion scholars were not pleased. They complained and they grumbled. He takes in sinners and he eats with them as if they were old friends. And their grumbling and their complaining triggered these stories. So from that setting then, Jesus tells the parable of first, a shepherd who had 100 sheep, loses one, leaves the 99 and goes searching for the one that's lost. Next in the chapter, the parable of the woman with 10 coins who loses one, turns the house upside down until she finds the one that's lost. And then finally, the parable of the father with 2 sons. Now understand the scene that Luke paints. The religious people, the people who pray, who read Scripture, who are regular at worship, who do what I do, they were complaining. Because Jesus, the epiphany of the kingdom of God, the living image of God, was letting the wrong sort of people in. They thought he was probably condoning their behavior, that he must be blessing their lifestyle, accommodating the culture, telling them what they want to hear, because why else would they be hanging around him? It's precisely why more and more people say, "I'm spiritual but not religious." And they don't mean by that they don't have any interest in God or the things of God or faith. What they mean is that they often don't see evidence of God and faith in religious people. And so they reject that kind of narrow, exclusive judgmentalism that they often hear and encounter in many churches. It's interesting to me that Methodism began as a reform movement within the Church of England. John Wesley, if you probably know this, wasn't starting a new church or a new denomination. Methodists in Wesley's day were kind of like a religious order, a lay religious order, men and women who felt a special call to enliven their faith and the life of the church, people who had taken vows, made commitments, who lived by a rule of life, a disciplined rule of life, watched over one another for support and accountability to that peculiar way of life. I love that about our tradition. I think that Wesleyan Methodist way of being Christian may in fact be a remedy to enliven the church today. Leading a disciplined life, attending to the means of grace, watching over one another in love in small groups, being held accountable for our life of discipleship. That's a real gift to the church. It's substantive, it has meaning and purpose. And yet there is a danger that, like the Pharisees and the religious scholars in the crowd that day, we will mistake the means for the end and become what our spiritual but not religious friends cannot abide: judgmental and narrow and exclusive. There's always the danger that will reduce the beautiful life that Jesus has called us to a rigid, rules-based club where a few claim that their way is the only way to God, and that they are in a position then to decide who gets in and who does not. Who's welcome to the feast. When in fact, the practices and the disciplines and the traditions of our faith, they're not there for their own sake. They're there to help us fall in love with God, who's already madly in love with us. They're there to help us draw so near to Christ that we become like Him and act like Him and sound like Him, loving all of our neighbors well, even our neighbors with questionable reputations. When I was ordained, the late Dr. Fred Craddock preached my ordination service. He was about my size, not a big guy. A high-pitched South Georgia accent. He taught at Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. I can't recall the exact text that he used, but he was a brilliant scholar and an even better preacher. But it was one of the places in the Gospels where the religious leaders came to put Jesus to the test. One of those stories. You may know some of them. To question Him, to try to trip Him up. Catch Him in some theological mistake so that they could discredit Him and discount His version of things. There were always, Dr. Craddock says, people around Jesus observing Him, wanting to give Him a quiz to see if He'd fail, so that they could say, our way to God is right, who we believe is in is correct, and all of this is wrong. He's not following the rules, and He's hanging out with people of questionable reputation. And so Jesus tells them a few stories about God. It seems that there is something about human nature that we'd rather exercise power and control than take the risk required to love. Henry Nouwen suggests maybe it is that power offers an easy substitute for the hard task of love. It seems easier to be God than to love God. It seems easier to control people than to love people. Easier to own life than to love life. Jesus asked, "Do you love me?" And we ask, "Can we sit at your right and left hand when you come into the kingdom?" Ever since the snake said, "The day you eat of this tree, your eyes will be open, and you will be like gods, knowing good from evil," we've been tempted to replace love with power. Jesus lived that temptation all the way from the desert to the cross, being a leader over, being led over being a leader. You know, the long, painful history of the church, there's a lot of good, but there's some pain there too, is the history of people ever and again tempted to choose power over love, control over the cross. But those who resist this temptation to the end thereby give us hope, and they are the true saints. He welcomes sinners and He eats with them. He acts like they're His friends. That is an expression of the desire to exercise power, to remake God in our image rather than to surrender and allow God to remake us in God's image, until we become so like Jesus that all the wrong sorts of people start hanging around us. Keller reminds us that the parables in Luke 15, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the father with two sons, these stories are really directed at the Pharisees and the religious scholars. Remember, they complained, so Jesus told them some stories. Jesus isn't rejecting them. Hear me clearly. This is not a rejection of those people. He loves them, and He's trying to help them see something that they've missed. There is certainly good news in these stories for that ragtag crowd that's gathered around Him, but these parables are really a word for the people who would be considered the good religious people of the day. They're aimed squarely at any among us, and I can point the finger at me, who are older brothers and sisters. As Keller notes, Jesus is pleading not so much with the immoral outsiders as He is with the moral insiders. He wants to show them their blindness and their narrowness and their self-righteousness, and how all these things are, hear this, destroying their own souls and the lives of the people around them. His story does reveal the self-destructive self-centeredness of the younger brother. There's not a past there. But as we will see as we work our way through the parable, it also condemns the elder brother's moralistic life as a way to God in the strongest of terms. If you work your way through the Gospels, Jesus' encounters with people, it's quite interesting and challenging that when Jesus meets, for instance, a religious person and a sexual outcast, or a religious person and a racial outcast, or a religious person and a political outcast, you get the picture. The outcast is most often the one who connects with Christ. And the elder brother type, the religious type, doesn't. I've wrestled with that all week long. Jesus' teaching, his presence, his way of life consistently attracted all the wrong sort of people. And I wonder if our life does too. And if it doesn't, why not? Friends, the bottom line is, if you don't hear anything else today, this is what I want you to hear. Religion will not save us, but a relationship will. And Jesus was trying to help those who had gathered that day to see that we're not called to religion, a system based on power that seeks to define who is worthy of God's prodigal love and who isn't worthy of God's prodigal love. We're called to faith, to a relationship, to place our trust in the God who loves us and who loves all our neighbors, and to trust that God's love alone is enough. Love is the way to healing, to forgiveness, to wholeness, new life. Only love can save the world. And God's love, thank goodness, is offered to anyone. Older brothers like me and younger brothers and sisters and older sisters and older brothers, all alike. Jesus welcomes all kinds of folks to dinner and treats them like friends. Thanks be to God.